Yeah, thanks so much, Stephanie and Melody, for joining the call. Thanks, Pastor James, for joining the call as well. And I hope that I think there might be a few other pastors, hopefully, who joined the call. They might be running a little bit late. But um, what I kind of announced to the pastors for this recorded Zoom meeting is, you know, I I announced some of the big ticket items that a lot of teens present to their pastors if they're brave enough to do so or desperate enough to do so. And I want to see whether these are the things that align with your experience, Stephanie and Melody, for what they're presenting to you. Some of the things that I listed were conflict with their parents. Um, I said high risk behaviors, and that can be a real catch-all phrase. Things that can involve cutting, that can involve substance use, um, maybe like lawlessness, things like that. I mentioned suicidality, coming out as gay, lesbian, trans, um, and though, I mean, I'm sure there are more, but those are some of the things that I mentioned to the pastors in my announcement to them. Melody, Stephanie, are those things that you are being presented with as well in your practice?
Yes, those are definitely with the conflict with parents. That's a huge one. I know right now I'm getting a lot of clients too with gender identity, and just them trying to navigate the world. With that, especially if they are involved in a church, right? Like, how does that fit in as well? So those, I would say those two are definitely ones I see frequently right now.
Okay. Melody,
Yeah,
what about you? What are you seeing?
definitely all the ones that you listed. And to that list, I would probably add all manners of anxiety along with it. I think especially during and then, continuing within this pandemic, there's a lot of anxiety around, the pandemic itself, social anxiety that's pandemic related, and then also just normal amounts of social anxiety when it comes to the teenage experience.
Okay.
And I think I've been seeing an increase in like performance related anxiety as well in my practice when it comes to teens.
Are you referring to like academic performance or like musical
Mhm.
performance, sports, that kind of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when you mentioned social anxiety, um, what are you hearing from the teens um, as it relates to the pandemic? Is it that they don't know how to interact with other teens at school, or they don't know how to interact with them um, with masks? Like, what are you hearing from them?
Yeah. I think especially last fall, there was definitely a spike of it when schools reopened and teens were going back to school in person. And
Right.
I think with a year of being home and not having that type of engagement, it's been hard for a lot of, at least the clients that I'm working with, to kind of reintegrate in a congruent way, where teens are already, second guessing and doubting, what am I saying? How are other people relating with me? And there's
Mm,
a really strong filter. And I think that during the year of not having that type of regular engagement, that's gotten pretty heightened. And I think a lot of teenagers are finding it hard to like bridge that in a way that feels right and congruent with who they are on the inside too.
interesting. Interesting. Okay. And Pastor James, so are there any topics that you would add to the ones that were already mentioned?
No, I mean, a lot of those are exactly what we are seeing with our youth. A lot of anxiety. I think that's a huge one, as was mentioned. But yeah, gender identity, I think that's something that we are trying to navigate well, and trying to really understand a little bit more of that. And then, of course, yeah, unfortunately, we have had a high number of students, not a high number, but I think I've been in youth ministry, especially in this church, for 18 years, and I've had maybe one or two throughout the course of just the 17 years before the pandemic and all of that, ever mentioned anything about maybe suicidal ideation or anything like that. But within just this past, like, maybe 6 to 8 months, I've heard 2 students share that, and have gone to facilities and met with others. And I think our heart too is trying to make sure, like, what else can we do in pastors, in terms of loving and caring for them, but also, what are some other things that maybe we can do to make sure that we are doing our very best at equipping the student, but also the parents and the community to just really help their child during that time. And so I think that's kind of one of my bigger questions as well. And I'm sure you guys got other things to talk about, but those are, yeah, definitely all the ones that you guys mentioned were things that I'm seeing very much showing up in our students right now.
Yeah, thanks for that. So why don't we use that as a springboard then? Let's talk about suicidality first. And again, it's a different, how clinicians treat suicidality and how a pastor as a frontline person approaches suicidality is going to be different. And so as a way to help pastors really get into the mindset of being a frontline worker, a responder, and trying to honor what their limitations are, and what they can best do as either someone who supplements, as a spiritual mentor, as a shepherd, to the people, hopefully, supplementing any sort of work that clinicians may do, or maybe a prescriber or anything like that. Melody or Stephanie, do you have any ideas of, like, how a pastor can wrap their head around their role so that they can embrace, what they can do, and not feel so, I guess, guilty about what they cannot do?
Yeah, I can definitely speak a little bit to it, and Stephanie can add on as well. Um, what comes to mind initially, I think, when it comes to thinking of yourself as a frontline worker, around suicidality, I know, just generally speaking, there's a lot of fear around talking about it, and it can lead to, being the first person that a teen or a student might talk to, like, hey, I'm having these thoughts. And if you have a fear about talking about the subject at all, then you might end up either consciously or inadvertently kind of shutting the conversation down. And then in doing that, you're really not leaning into the role that you have as being a frontline person, a frontline worker when it comes to suicidality. So I think an important thing to kind of start and to really take in and let it kind of reframe how you think about suicidality, is that talking about suicidality does not make it worse. That's, I think, a really big thing to start and to just know as pastors, and just in general. I think we have this misconception that, talking about suicidality, something that is so scary and so obviously immense and heavy, might somehow make it worse. So let's not talk about it. Let's try to shy away from it. When in fact, talking about it doesn't make it worse, but it can actually help. Sometimes students, they're holding this big thing inside, and it becomes bigger and bigger when just talking about it with someone who's safe and can tell them, hey, it's not abnormal to have thoughts of dying or to even have thoughts of suicide. Like, let's talk about it together in this safe way, can already do a lot to alleviate the distress that someone might have if they're just holding it inside. I like to think about, just within church, how we, talk about Jesus's death and resurrection all the time. We have this language around like death and dying and, you know, like the hope of resurrection and all of that. And I think, you know, if we kind of lean into just the normality of that language and maybe integrate it too, to say, okay, let's be okay talking about mental health struggles, including suicidal ideation.
Mm,
And then from there, filtering, you know, within yourself, like how comfortable am I sitting with someone and talking
mhm.
about this more? And when I definitely notice my limit, knowing I can, you know, refer the student to a mental health professional who can help them continue on in that journey of like processing and hopefully healing.
Great.
Yeah, going on from that to what Melody said, those are super important aspects. I would also be mindful of the resources in your community too, you know, with like brochures, flyers, knowing where those
Mm,
resources are. Because if a teen does come up to you and discloses this information, you want to be that safe place and whatnot. But if you have those resources, I like to say the more positive support and the more resources you have, it's just going to make it a little bit easier or a little bit more manageable to access this difficult time. And what Melody said, if you're keeping it all to yourself, isolation makes symptoms worse. So if you have more resources or more positive support, it's just going to be a little bit, like I mentioned, easier to navigate as well. I like to say be where the client is too. So if they're coming into that space telling you about, hey, I am suicidal or whatnot, just be there with them. Ask them how they like what they need. I would say that's a big thing when I work with teens. A lot
mm,
of the times it's people telling them what to do, especially if it's their
mhm.
parents and things like that. Like, you know, hey, you should be doing this, you should be doing this. So if you just actively listen, you know, reflective listen and things like that. And then at the end, maybe, or even during it, like, how can I help you out? Right. And I know that must have been really hard, right? Using empathy too, right? And that must have been really
Mm,
hard to tell me, I'm really glad that you did. How can I better assist you? Or how can I help you out? So that allows them to, you know, take ownership of that conversation and helps them, you know, have that, I would say, that active role within their lives. Because there's probably so much stuff that's, you know, out of their control. This may be something that's in their control.
great stuff.
Mhm.
Pastor James, any follow-up question based on what Melody and Stephanie shared?
I guess, yeah, in terms of, you know, I think this is something that we've been kind of changing and evolving, especially throughout the years. I think, you know, I remember growing up in a church and always being heard that everything's confidential, everything's confidential. And so then that line got blurry, you know, especially as I moved in from being a student to being one of the leaders and to becoming my role now and trying to help our leaders kind of cultivate, you know, that opportunity of maybe if they have discussions with the student where this is brought up, you know, they struggle and they're thinking, well, I don't want to break confidentiality. I don't want to break confidentiality. And so I guess in terms of how you would recommend us acknowledging that we lovingly care for them and we want to help them and this is a safe place for them to share, but also kind of reaffirming that thought of like, but if, you know, we need to, we you know, we feel very much that it's for their best interest to share that information with people that can support them and help them and encourage them. I think many of you guys know because teens, they just feel like they can't tell their parents or they're going to get in trouble. And I know
Yeah.
a lot of trying to reframe that for them, but would you guys have any suggestions on what we can teach our leaders or even the language that I use as a pastor in regards to speaking with students and sometimes them thinking of confidentiality in a specific way?
Great question.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend to, you know, having that conversation too. How would you feel if we did tell your parents? Like, what would that look like?
Mm,
And if they go, no, I do not want to tell my parents whatsoever, focusing on maybe somebody else. Like, is there somebody else that you trust that you could have this conversation with? Maybe it's not parents, but maybe it is another adult, or maybe it's like an older sibling or something. So that can help because, you know, sometimes when it is parents, it's, oh my goodness, I don't want to tell them at all. And I mean, certainly sometimes there are those times when you do have to break confidentiality and tell their parents. But if there's other individuals too that they can access or tell, like I said, positive support, having that's really helpful. And if you do have to disclose things to their parents, still going into that role of, okay, yes, we do have to disclose this, but how do we want to go about it? So it's giving them a little bit of that power back. Do you want me to discuss it with them in the room? Do you want me like on my own? and whatnot. So letting them have a little bit of that power back.
Stephanie, I can tell from this comment and your previous comment that um, you're so geared towards empowering the student, empowering the teen. That's so it's so good for other clinicians to hear, and also for pastors to hear too, because we are so trained to kind of tell the teens like what to do, and we're going to do this for you, and kind of take away your power, but you're kind of reclaiming it back for the teens. So I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, and then I look really young too. So I don't want to be that parental role, and that's not my job either. My job is to be there for the clients and just being mindful, right? They are teens. A lot of people are telling them what they should do. So my space is hopefully a space where they can just have that time, or they can just have that voice too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I will add a little bit when it comes to confidentiality, like Pastor James, you're asking about, and maybe Roy, you can speak a little bit to this, because I don't know, what sort of like training or kind of like standard practice it is for pastors. As therapists, usually within our consent forms, it's spelled out really clearly, like, what confidentiality means, and then what the limits of that confidentiality are, and at what points, risks for safety will come in and end up trumping the confidentiality that we do have set within therapy. So usually, in sessions where as a therapist, you're realizing, I think we're writing that line where maybe like the limits of confidentiality are coming in. We might, just kind of like couch it for the client that we're sitting with, remind them of it, and then also frame it within the lens of safety. And like, it's because, we care about your safety, and we're here, and we're going to support you through it. And like Stephanie said, really holding the client's autonomy and their choice within it as well. Like, how can we continue to make sure that you have control within the setting, even if we need to break the confidentiality?
Right.
Another thought that I had, and kind of question too, I don't know for pastors if it's common in churches to also learn a bit about suicide risk assessment. I know one of the old school ones is the Columbia suicide risk assessment that therapists definitely get training on, but it can be helpful, I think, to even just really briefly train the pastoral team, the leadership team in churches, to kind of know the different questions to ask when it comes to a student who might come and say, I'm having thoughts of suicide. And then as a frontline worker, you can really quickly gauge through a couple of questions. Within the past 30 days, have you been thinking about like hurting yourself or thoughts of death? And then if you have been having thoughts of like wanting to hurt yourself or wanting to kill yourself, like, do you have a plan? If you have a plan, do you have the means to do it? If you have the means, do you have the intent to do it? So it's kind of these different questions that you can go through. And I think for a lot of students, it might just end up being, okay, it's the first question is a yes, and then there's no's for the rest of the questions there. Like, I really have just been being a little, like, I've been feeling scared by these thoughts, and I want to talk to someone trusted about it, but I haven't been thinking through like a plan, and I don't have the intent. And really, I just need that safe space. And from a therapeutic perspective, that would be where we would probably maintain the confidentiality and just hold the space. And as the risk gets more and more, that's when we definitely start thinking about, okay, I might need to break confidentiality to ensure that my client is safe in this moment. So
I have two follow-up questions. One of you mentioned brochures. Do either of you have brochures that you would recommend for pastors to have handy?
I have it actually in my wallet. It's just a little like postcard. It's about suicidality. There's also with Hope. foundation that was made. It's for teenagers with suicidality.
Mhm.
They have a lot of really good resources on there. And like I said, if it's something just small, like a, like the business card and having that
Mhm.
information, it's just something that can be easily accessed.
The other follow-up question I had was, for youth pastors, it's always a complex dance when it comes to kids and then their parents. I know that some churches and the parents, they have this very concrete um, assumption or expectation that the youth pastor will tell them everything. Um, and that's going to be tricky when it comes to the kids who kind of also assume that the pastors will not tell their parents, what they're saying. So um, do either of you recommend like youth pastors having some sort of a workshop for the parents to tell them like what their policy is, when it comes to talking with the kids and what is kept confidential and all that kind of stuff? Like, or is it more just like case by case? How do you recommend that pastors approach that situation? Because the parents really might have very different expectations than what the pastors have and even what the kids have.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even hearing you share a little bit about that, I'm feeling the tension there that
Yeah.
we as therapists also feel when we're working with teens, and maintaining confidentiality. And there are definitely parents that have this expectation. Well, like, you're going to tell me everything that
Yeah.
my child is telling you about. I want to know how they're doing. And that's not our role, like Stephanie was saying, right? I'm not here to align with the parents, and I'm not leaning into the parental role either. I don't know if like holding a workshop around that specifically would be the best route to go about it. But and Stephanie, I don't know if you have any like more concrete thoughts about it, but I think um, it might be more of a case by case sort of basis is kind of what I'm feeling, even as I'm like talking through this right now.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would say too, I think it's a little bit more structured as a therapist because you have that intake assessment. And at least when I do an
Mhm.
intake assessment, usually have the parent and client in there,
Right.
especially when it is, the expectations and guidelines for therapy. So that's already established at the very beginning.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit more challenging if it's a youth group because you don't have that
Mhm.
quote unquote paperwork. So what Melody was
Yeah.
saying, it might just be a case by case basis, or if it maybe is a new student or a new individual joining the group,
Mhm.
maybe I don't know if that's just paperwork, just like safety paperwork that you add prior to the beginning. Not Don't necessarily know the answer, but that's just kind of a thought.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to switch gears and see if Pastor James wants to uh, lead us to the next topic. So, you have the privilege, since you're here participating in this seminar, to get your questions answered. So, is there a next topic that you'd like to discuss with us?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I've always kind of wondered or tried to figure out is, as a pastor, playing kind of that frontline worker role, or that place for a lot of students to get them maybe connected. I think one thing that we've struggled with, or kind of try to navigate through, was if maybe a student seems to really does present themselves to struggling with some sort of mental health um, uh, difficulty, and they're open to wanting to go see a therapist or a counselor, but their parents aren't. And or they, parents are very like against it, or just don't think that it's necessary, or or maybe financially they have other reasons as well. And so I'm just wondering, for us as a church, is there any things that you guys could recommend that we could suggest to the student or the parent, and those types of conversations, and to try to help a student that desires that help, but maybe parental roles just don't want to maybe move in that direction.
Great
Yeah,
question.
I can comment on that. I mean, even if you have parents that are divorced, one parent might consent and the other one's like, no.
That's true.
So that could be hard too. So when I have that, at least in my office, I then recommend to the client, hey, there's resources at school. There's mental health counselors at school. That might be at first the easiest avenue to access. And because parents consent for, school education purposes. So if they want mental health, maybe the school district or their school could be a great place to have that resource where, it's not a financial burden, but it's not after school. Sometimes it's within the school district or the school itself. So that could be a potential resource.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of that too. In terms of my own training, I started out as a trainee within a school district too. And there
Me
are so
too.
many school districts, especially in, the Southern California region that do a pretty good job of providing mental health to their students during school time. And it can be a really kind of low barrier entry point into getting counseling and getting therapy. Another thought that I did have, I think as pastors, something that you can start implementing is kind of like a culture shift within the church itself, to start talking more openly about mental health in general, just normalizing that conversation, and then also normalizing seeking therapy. I think that is something that I'm seeing more and more in different churches, and it's something that's really encouraging and I think really helpful for just teens and also the children and the next generation to be able to have that openness in talking about it. And I think that as it becomes more normal, hopefully, there's also just a spreading out effect to get to the parents too. And I have seen that, even within the past couple of years, I've been hearing more parents say, I never had this, but I'm open to it now for my kids. I don't know very much about it. Can you tell me a little bit more about therapy? So I think there is hope.
I really love that idea of the culture shift. I remember speaking to at some sort of a church event, and there were a number of pastors and elders present at that talk, and I told them that their decisions and their actions are modeling behaviors for the rest of the church. And so I said to them, there are a couple things that you can do to really promote more mental health in your church. And one of them is actively setting aside budget, because when there are congregation meetings and they're talking about where the money is going, and they see all this money towards family ministries and kids activities and stuff, but then there's a deficit. There's nothing really there for mental health, and that speaks volumes. But if there's a significant percentage that is set aside for mental health services, then they're really putting their money where their mouth is. But secondly, I will tell them, hey, pastors and elders, I really urge you to get your own counseling, not because you're necessarily in crisis, but to do either fine tuning, to do maintenance, to just kind of have some self-evaluation, and not only to get that counseling for yourself, but to speak openly about it to your church and say, in my therapy, I learned this and whatever. And so you're kind of normalizing that language. And so if a youth pastor and the youth workers talk to their kids, talk to the students, and then talk to the parents saying, yeah, in my therapy, and the parents are like, wait, what? you go to therapy, and so just this becomes somewhat of a kind of a shock to the system, but then they eventually get used to hearing language like that, and they're saying, oh wow, so the entire youth staff go to therapy, the entire pastoral staff goes to therapy, then okay, maybe I'm kind of late in the game. Maybe the parents would wrap their heads around that through that type of cultural shift, but it might take a year or two, but we got to start sometime. follow-up question to what we said, or even a new topic?
No, yeah, no, thank you guys. That was really great. I think maybe another follow-up question, I guess, is yeah, I think gender identity, of course, is something that's becoming a bigger conversation. And I think just as a church, just want to know what to do and how to navigate it well. I think we were just talking about, we haven't actually had any teens bring it up just yet, but we did have one teen that identified themselves as female, even though they were born male. And we had known this child for a long time, and so I think there was a lot of relational equity that we had built up with them, and so it never became something that was offensive if we called them he or she, if we didn't do those kind of things. But we also know that that's not going to always be the case, because we're going to have we did actually have one student that shared with us about their maybe journey in trying to figure out their gender. And I think we've been getting pushback from parents about like, hey, how are you allowing this? Why are you allowing this? Or, please just identify them by their biological, and all of this stuff.
Sure.
And there's a lot of things that are going on where I feel like, just I'm wondering how you guys would maybe recommend we handle those types of situations, those interactions, and what are some things that we can be more educated on ourselves, but also educate maybe some of our parents and church and students and all of that, our leaders in that kind of field of just this new thing for us right now.
It's a great question, and I want to preface all of our answers by really acknowledging how complicated this is. I'm still learning as I go, and what I'm realizing is that from seminary to seminary and church to church and pastor to pastor, we're going to land on different interpretations of scripture. There will be the camp that says homosexuality and gender issues, even just like the challenging of gender issues, these are overt sin that would be considered an abomination to God. And so they would say, by no means, we need to just nip this in the bud, and we're either not going to talk about it or we'll just shut it down. There will be those who say, no, that is an outdated interpretation and it's not sin, and everything goes. There will be those who do believe that it is a sin, and yet the way that they try to talk about it is couched with as much love and respect as possible, and everything in between. So therapists and pastors and churches, and even within the churches, they're going to have very different opinions about this. And I think the common thread here is how do we respect our own stance on this, and how do we make room for other people having their own stance on it, and especially how do we do no harm to the person who is bravely talking to us about this very, very important issue for them. That it is a immensely complex issue, and no one does it perfectly. For sure I don't, but I want to make sure that we all understand that there are so many ways of approaching this, and even like our three opinions are just like a drop in the bucket. There's just so many beyond ours. So I hope, Pastor James, you can take what we say as the way that we view it, but there will be many, many other opinions out there too.
Thanks for providing that kind of couching, Roy. Even, as you're sharing, like one thing that I have been thinking about within my practice too, working with clients that come in at, different stages of processing and kind of like exploring and redefining what gender identity could look like for them. I think one thing that is a challenge for adults that are within their lives is that they're not really a part of any of the process until the end stage, or until the coming out, right? That's kind of how how things are kind of set up culturally too, right? Like the coming out moment, and before that, you're kind of processing either just with your own self, like internally, right? And then you come out
Right.
to your friends, and then you come out to your family, and then you come out to your church, for example. Um, and a lot of that is, like congruent to teen development, I think. And then a lot of that is also maybe in feeling like there aren't a lot of safe places
Right.
to process um, on your own or process with others. So I think that is an area where for pastors, um, it could be something to think about, and then to like really build out in terms of like normalizing, like talking about this,
Mm.
normalizing just being involved in earlier points in the process, so that students aren't, coming up and like forming things or wrestling with really, really big questions all by themselves. Um, so I think that comes from building a culture of like safety and openness and normalizing having this conversation, and then also really like working out how do we hold a space that isn't immediately providing like judgment,
Mhm.
right? And like a prescriptive, like this is how you're supposed to think, but like we can have a solid foundation in our faith, and also not be afraid of you know considering like questions that are very controversial,
Mhm.
but we can still talk about it together, and that way there can be more openness in wherever the students are at, as opposed to having to kind of react after they've already gotten to a place of maybe like deeper formation. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's kind of like something that I've noticed.
Yes. Really good.
Yeah, in regards to this, I always go back to one of my really good friends works with specifically with the LGBTQIA plus community. When I asked her about teens, her number one thing that she told me is even if parents have differences, they're frustrated, maybe upset or whatnot, we can always agree upon making sure our clients or for them, their kids are safe, happy, and healthy.
Mm.
So if we can just kind of focus on that, do like, okay, is this client or is this teen, are they safe? Are we going to help them like instill maybe like happiness and health? Those three things I think parents and maybe even pastors can agree upon. So sometimes when we focus our attention on that, and then it's just that common ground.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I remember um, in my youth pastor days, the uh, the issue of um, homosexuality, transgender, uh, queerness, it actually never came up.
Mhm.
And it wasn't taught in my seminary either. So I was just clueless. I didn't know how to navigate any of that. Even when I transitioned to adult ministry, it never came up. It's really only during my therapist training that it came up, and I felt like, oh crap, like how do I deal with this? I need to deal with my own understanding of the issues plus
Mhm.
my clinical approach to the issues, and I felt like I was kind of drowning. I didn't know what to do, and so I have a lot of empathy for pastors who might be blindsided, but who maybe they're not taught anything about this in seminary either. They have their own opinions about it from their own personal Bible studies, from maybe favorite authors that they've written. I'm sure if they read MacArthur, they'll have one opinion. If they read someone else who's a bit more progressive, a more progressive theologian, they might have a different opinion. But a lot of their thoughts are going to be formulated by that. But then when they actually have a live person in front of them telling them, I'm really struggling with being queer, I'm thinking about coming out. You know, I believe that I truly am a female, even though I was born male. Like all these different issues. I'm considering getting, you know, teeth therapy. It's like I think the deer in headlights is, you know, effect is going to be very real for a lot of pastors,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel for them. And yet I also feel for the person who's thinking, like you said, Melody, like there's many steps that they take before they actually reveal to their pastor or their small group leader, I think I'm gay, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And if they get the deer in headlights reaction from that person, or the reaction that they feared the most, and it actually comes true, that's crushing, you know, for that person. So it is so important to um, have every pastor and every youth worker uh, to read up, to listen to a lot of different sides,
Mm-hmm.
to speak to one another about it, to be comfortable with talking about it, so that when the students do broach the topic with them, that they're not like completely shocked, you know, by it, but that they actually
Yeah.
have something to say that is grace filled. Stephanie, I like
Mm-hmm.
what you talked about, the safety as a real common denominator.
Yeah.
These are all really good fundamental things that we can do, that every pastor can do, even if they may disagree on like the theology behind it all, but at least the common denominator all pastors can do.
Yeah, no, thank you guys all. I know that this is a very, very complex issue and there's still so much to learn and understand about everything, but I really appreciate it, like what you guys are saying. I think especially along those lines of wanting to, you know, like you guys mentioned, that our heart as a pastor is to love these people and care for these people. And, you know, and for them to come to this place to even share something like that. I know, like Melody said, I didn't even think about that, but the realization that they probably had thought through and struggled and you know, had probably agonized over doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Roy put it so perfect, like that deer in the headlights. I feel like I've had those moments, and so I can only see how, man, for many of those that maybe I have conversation with, that was you know, their worst fear coming to life. Like, here's this person I'm coming to share this with, and
Yeah.
they don't know what to say or don't know what to do or how to react. And so I really appreciate some of those practical things that you brought up that I can take back to our staff and talk to others about. Like, let's just have conversations so that when we are, you know, faced with a student maybe possibly bringing this up, that we're not just can't even say anything or don't know what to say at all or anything like that. But I love how Stephanie shared about that common ground and finding, you know, that, you know, how can we love this person and care for them, provide them a safe place as they're sharing something so vulnerable and so probably so difficult for them to uh, bring to this conversation. But yeah, I mean, I guess my other thought is, you know, with teens especially, you know, what are some other things that you guys have seen that would be super beneficial for myself, other youth leaders and workers, you know, in regards to students and their struggle through anxiety or depression? I think one of the things that we've noticed is that because, you know, information is just so readily available for teens now, sometimes I almost feel like it's a double-edged sword, because they kind of read something and they self-diagnose themselves, or they
Yeah.
kind of, you know, already, you know, or they hear and you know, other people share about some of their things and they just automatically attach it to themselves. And so, you know, I think we're in no position to maybe confirm or deny those type of things, but at the same time, like, how could we help them if they're coming and they're already like saying like, I have anxiety, and when we ask them, have you talked to someone else about it, they're like, no, I haven't. But you know, they kind of quote these things. Like, what are some things that maybe we can do in terms of, like, you know, those resources that you mentioned, Stephanie, and all of that? Like, what are some ways that we can really kind of walk with teens through maybe depression or anxiety, or, you know, all these other things that I think so easy sometimes, you know, I've heard pastors say, pray it away, you know, or just something like that, you know. But like, you know,
Mhm.
I know those are very important and, you know, tools that you can offer and help, but, you know, I know it's so much more than that too.
Stephanie, do you want to speak to that? I- I
Yeah,
feel
I
like
can
you've already shared a bit. Yeah.
I can. I would say with that too, I think at least when I work with teens, sometimes it's the first time coming into therapy, don't know what to expect or things like that. So I feel like with teenagers, especially, the number one thing is trust and rapport. Um, with everything. So it's kind of meeting them where they're at, like I mentioned. If they are coming with to you discussing like anxiety or depressive symptoms, it is using that active listening, reflective. I think that's super critical with working with them too. I would also be mindful when I work with teens, if they disclose anything about, like family, their interests, hobbies, remember the names, remember what they liked, and things like that. And then do your research about it too. So if a client, like for me, if a lot of my clients are into anime, so if they mention an anime, I watch it. And then next time I meet with them, I talk about it and whatnot. So, and when you do so as well, when they are mentioning like anxiety and depressive symptoms, and they've talked about things that are like make them like happy or like a good distraction, you can bring those things back up again. Hey, like you mentioned to me that there's these things in your life that like are beneficial or positive. Like, oh, you mentioned that like anime. Do you ever turn to that? Right? When it is a difficult time, or maybe it is scripture or whatnot. So it's being mindful of what they're stating to you, the resources that they're discussing, and bringing that back up potentially if they do mention maybe those anxiety or depressive symptoms. And like I said, just being that support system, expressing like, wow, that must have been really difficult for you to share that with me. I'm really glad that you did. How can I help you? What's something I can do?
It's definitely after you become an expert in Demon Slayer and Naruto.
Yes,
And,
yes. My dog's actually named after anime, so I'm like, okay, thank goodness.
You leaned all the way in.
Yeah. My husband likes that stuff too, so I'm like, oh, okay, my husband liked it. I'm like, okay, now I'm getting a lot of clients, or like if they like their guitars too, like sometimes I'll bring them into session and play. I just hold that space for them.
Is one of your pets named Airbender?
No, it's Winry. It's after
Winry.
like, yeah, after Full Metal Alchemist brother.
That's great.
So yeah, I mean, and having, and I would say like surface level disclosing to my clients, like about my dogs, about like my interests too. It just makes me feel a little bit more human. And disclosing too, like I've been in therapy and learning stuff as well. It just makes you feel like it's not just this, you're up here and I'm down here. I want to make sure we're on the same page.
Yeah, I like 100% like am behind you, Stephanie, when it comes to working with teens. Meeting them where they're at is a huge thing. And I think, as therapists, we're always mindful of the power dynamic in the room, right? That like we're the therapists and they're the client here, and how can we make sure that we're always supporting their autonomy, their sense of control, and being here, like them setting the pace, right, of the therapeutic work and like what they want to come in and talk about. And I feel like maybe when it comes to the pastoral role, that power dynamic is probably even more present, right? Like you're the youth pastor and they're, meeting with you, and just kind of thinking about how to very practically like meet them where they're at. And if they're coming in, with anxiety or depression or any other, struggle, that you're holding that space and trying your best to help them have some autonomy. And you're communicating like, I really like respect and want to hear from you, and I don't want to be prescriptive or to dictate like what I think you should do, which is what they're probably getting a ton of, right, like everywhere else in their lives. So I think like one really practical piece of like suggestion would be like to just listen openly, and like without providing any judgment or any immediate feedback. And one thing I think with teens, like this isn't necessarily within therapy, but I think elsewhere, like what I found to be really effective is even before providing feedback, trying to like ask permission or ask how open they are to it first. So that way you're still giving them the control before you're bringing in your own opinion. And that can really like change someone's heart stance, right? In terms of their openness, if they're the one saying like, yeah, I would like to know what Pastor James, you think about what I just shared with you. And it can be really refreshing to them to hear someone in a position of authority say, like, thanks for sharing that with me. Like, how open are you to hearing some of my thoughts? And have them invite you into that. And I like, Pastor James, what you're sharing about like relational capital with different students. And I think with some teens, like it does take time to build upon that relational capital, and meeting them where they're at can also look like just being patient, just being present as a safe person, but not trying to force them to share, right? But just really waiting for that timing.
The last thing I'll share, and then we'll end our call around 11:30, is like I said in the beginning of our beginning of the hour, I have a lot of regrets about maybe missed opportunities when I was a pastor, and or maybe things that I said too much. And I think now that I've been practicing how to provide some sort of safety for my clients, especially when it comes to spiritual conversations, because I know that I think when I was a pastor, I assumed that every person who came to me was ready to have a spiritual conversation with me. Like my assumption was that they're this mature, they're mature in Christ. They're just like the Apostle Paul, and let's just go at it, right? But that's not true. A lot of them are in such different stages of their spiritual journey that some are just straight up pissed off at God, and they don't want to do anything with prayer. They don't want anything to do with Christ. And so what I urge pastors to do when they can kind of sense that the opportunity is right, and that takes some practice too, is really being curious about how, I was going to say the client, how the member, how the youth person, how the student, how they experience Christ without any judgment, right? So like if they are depressed, or if they're super anxious, if they're thinking about coming out, if they're whatever it is, when the timing is right, just to be able to ask them, where is Christ right now? And sometimes it's such an abstract question that I use my Lego figurines and put it onto a table. And I use one figure to represent them. I use another figure to represent maybe their parents, and use another figure to represent Christ. And, I'd say like, okay, where are you right now on the table? And they would place it. And then I'd be like, you've been telling me, about your anxiety, and it just sounds so dark. Where do you think Jesus is right now? And I'm not looking for the Sunday school answer. I'm looking for your honest answer. Like where does Jesus feel? Where does it feel like he is right now? And sometimes the person might say he's off the table. I'm here broken in pieces on the table, and Jesus is nowhere to be found. And I think my 15 years ago pastor self would say, oh, but he's not. The scripture says that he's this, this and this, but they're not ready to hear that sometimes. Sometimes they just want me to say, I'm so sorry for what you're experiencing right now. That sounds so miserable, that you are broken on the table and Jesus is nowhere to be found. That sounds horrific. And they're like, yeah, it is horrific. And so to soothe our own anxiety as pastors of trying to swoop in and get them out of that feeling, and using scripture to get them out of that feeling. That's what I used to do. But I think for what they're going through right now, it's more important for them to experience you as being someone who aligns with them and who kind of gets what they're going through. And there will come maybe at step 15 or 25, a time where they're ready for you to give scripture when they're actually wanting the scripture that can teach them what's reality. Even though you as the pastor know what's reality, they may not be ready for that yet. So I would say, whether you use figurines, whether you just, use plain language, but just to really, explore with them, because, you are shepherds, like, what is their experience of Christ in the midst of their crisis, in the midst of their depression, and to just say, I'm with you, like I can totally see why you're feeling that way. And I'm not going to argue you out of it. I'm just here to really experience that with you and be by your side. And when you're ready, you can come talk to me about processing this, from, if it's a clinical standpoint, and I have some great referrals for you. If you want to talk about it from a spiritual standpoint, from a scriptural standpoint, I'm ready to talk to you, but, I want to go at your pace, right? I feel like that's one of my biggest regrets as a pastor is like, I rushed too quickly out of my own anxiety to get them out of their mood, because I couldn't handle it. Quite honestly, I couldn't handle their anxiety, and I couldn't handle their depression, and I couldn't handle either not knowing the right answer or them not knowing the right answer. It was too intolerable for me. But I think my years as a clinician has given me a bit more practice in being okay with that. And I think pastors can do well in learning how to tolerate that discomfort as well.
So good, right?
Yeah. And it's going back to kind of like validating, being where the individual is at, kind of like that unconditional positive regard, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
Right. Okay, so I want to honor all of your time. I hope that what we discussed today was helpful, Pastor James, and I'll have this available on replay on the Pastoral Counseling Guild channel. And yeah, I just want to thank you, Stephanie and Melody, for investing your time. I know that you have a heart for the church, a heart for pastors, and a heart for the kids. I'm glad that you can lend your wisdom today.
You're welcome, and thanks for organizing this for us.
Yes. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Roy.
All right, Pastor James, take care. So glad you could be here today.
Thank you guys again. Thank you so much for doing this. I think, my heart is, I love our students, and we just want to care for them as best as we can. And I know that you guys providing all of this is so helpful, and I'm just so appreciative of you guys taking the time to share all of this with you, with me, and with everyone that will listen and watch. So thank you once again. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. And I'll have on the YouTube episode, I'll have both Stephanie's and Melody's contact information on there. So if you want to reach out to them yourself, or if you want to share their contact info with other pastors, then I'll have that provided for you. Okay, take care, everyone.